So, there's a certain kind of appeal there. On the other hand, it does raise certain kinds of issues. One of the standard issues, actually a very basic issue it raises, was one that was noticed already by the philosopher Socrates and his student Plato already in the 300s, 400s BCE. And this was noticed in a work, or at least written down in a work called the Euthyphro. And the Euthyphro is this dialogue between Socrates and a person by this name, the Euthyphro. It's kind of an odd situation. Euthyphro's father has accidentally killed a slave, and Euthyphro feels his father is guilty and should be prosecuted. And so he gets in this discussion with Socrates about more or less the relationship between religion and ethics. And there comes this point in the dialogue where a question is posed about this relationship. And in the context, dialogue is about piety and ethics, but later philosophers see in this really a relationship between religion and philosophy, or religion and ethics. And the question that is posed goes something like this. So I'm paraphrasing here. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? So Socrates asks this question, more or less, and it creates a dilemma that for the divine command theorist seems to have no good way out. So let's take up the first half of the dilemma. So let's suppose that something is good because God commands it. This is what divine command theory would say. And now let's think about what that would mean. Something is good because God commands it, and further, something is good only because God commands it. But, Socrates observes, if this is the case, this runs the risk of making ethics seem arbitrary, arbitrarily dependent upon God's will. We can imagine that God changes God's mind. And if God can change God's mind, then what was good yesterday will be bad today, and could be good again tomorrow. So if we take a kind of the standard example, just the example of murder, murder is wrong, and if we ask why is it wrong on the count of divine command theory, it's wrong simply because God says it's wrong. But if God changed God's mind tomorrow, then murder would not be wrong. Now, that seems troubling to us. It seems that murder is wrong just no matter what. And so if you're religious and you buy into divine command theory, this may trouble you as well. Now, you might say, well, God doesn't change God's mind. And so one way out of this is perhaps to endorse you might say, a modified divine command theory. Philosophers like Robert Adams have proposed something like this. So on a modified divine command theory, we might insist really that the notion of God is really connected to the notion of goodness. So that God could not will something that would be evil. But then there's still this issue of whether it's the divine command that makes something good, or if it's this other principle that is part of God's nature and which we hope will be part of ours as well. Now, if we take up the second half of the dilemma, if God commands something because it is good, then this would certainly still be a good thing, But then we're moving out of the realm of divine command theory. So the goodness of something is not because God commands it. It is because of some other reason. Some universal principle, perhaps. And it just happens that God also commands it. Okay, so if this is true, then divine command theory is false. If this is true, then divine command theory seems arbitrary unless we can make some move to modify it in a more satisfying way. Alright, so that's one kind of way that at least some try to connect religion and ethics and some of the problems associated with it. A second way is by appealing to what's called natural law or natural law theory. Natural law, as a way of thinking about ethics, has a long history. We can trace it back at least to the ancient Stoic philosophers in Greece and Rome. It is then taken up by the Catholic Church, notably by the philosopher, 13th century philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, and was influential then later on as well, and actually kind of morphed over time into the notion of natural rights in thinkers like John Locke. So, the idea of natural law is connected to religion in the sense that, from a religious perspective, the world is created by God, the world is good, and because the world is created by God and good, what is natural in its original sense would also be good. When we look at human beings, at least on a traditional account, we can understand human beings as having an inherent purpose, a nature to them, a directedness, so that there is something that it is good to be a human being. There is a natural law that we must accord to. And indeed, we might argue that there is a natural light of reason that perceives this universal natural law. So we can appeal to conscience in a sense. Because God has made us good and has given us this conscience, we can appeal to it and then act accordingly. Now, on this account, notice that to be ethical does not necessarily require one to be religious. The light of natural reason may inform us, even though we may not be aware of, from a Christian perspective, for instance, of the truth of revelation and so on. But it might be the case that our ethical nature is completed by an understanding of religion. At least this is what Thomas Aquinas claims. So there's that natural law we all have appeal to that's written in our hearts, and then there's those further truths which are gained only from revelation. Now, this has some appeal, and it gets away a little bit from some of the problems of divine command theory, because it seems less arbitrary, that because we human beings have a nature, God just can't change God's mind. But we can still ask some questions about it. So one kind of question is just this question of the light of natural reason, whether this is something that we can all agree on or not. And we can also ask if religion is really essential here as well. We might note that some contemporary theorists appeal to natural law theory, but don't talk about God as a source of natural law, but just the natural laws of the universe. Perhaps even the laws of evolution. So someone like the philosopher Larry Arnhart would be an example of this kind of thinking. All right, so that's the second way of thinking. You might think about if natural law theory is stronger than divine command theory or not, and what some of the problems might be. I might note here that with natural law theory, sometimes this is used in debates about sexuality, but which is used in some ways that can be problematic. And so one standard criticism of natural law theory is that although there might be a sense of human purposiveness, there may be more than one purpose to being human. And so if you think of an analogy to a hammer has a purpose of hammering nails, but also can be used to pull out nails, to smash drywall, and if it has a wood handle, you can even use it to start a fire. And so this notion of purpose comes into to play. All right, some further issues. Let me just mention one or two. If it's the case that we try to ground religion in, if it's the case that we try to ground ethics in religion, one very basic problem occurs once we start to move into the public sphere. So if it's the case that, let's say, you're a Christian and you believe that ethics is rooted in the very specific content of the Christian Bible, this creates an issue when we go to debate in the public square, because now in the public square, some of the other people may be Christians, but some others may be Jews or Muslims or atheists or none of the above. And so now the question comes, how do we deliberate together about what's good for the community if the only truths that can appeal to are those truths that are found in my scripture, which other people do not share. In addition, we might observe descriptively that even among Christians, or among Jews and Muslims, there tends to be a substantial disagreement about how to interpret the Bible. So this is another layer of problems. So just as there are secular individuals who are conservative and secular individuals who are liberal, so too there are liberal Christians and conservative Christians, and both appeal to the Bible as a source. So that's a problem, and we actually might point that as two problems. So one is just the problem of interpreting scriptures from within a religious tradition, and then secondly, how do we arrive at moral agreement when we come from different religious or secular traditions. Now, you might note in Louis Poyman's textbook, How Shall We Live, that Poyman suggests that religion is not the source of ethics, but religion provides a motivator to be ethical. And so you might see this as a kind of middle ground, and you can think about whether that's a good argument or not. That maybe it's the case that ethics is independent of religion, but for individuals who provide, who have a religious framework, this provides additional incentive. And so that would be a kind of in-between space between saying that religion is essential to ethics and religion has no role at all. So, something to think about, and you can decide for yourself whether that's a good suggestion